Good morning. Yesterday we talked about the importance of the new song and all that it offers and the indispensability of having a song and singing. Today we want to talk about understanding the new song. Now, as a small boy, I took a great interest in singing, but the vocabulary of the church's great hymns sometimes stumbled me. And a case in point is the song, "Arise, My Soul, Arise." It says, "Before the throne my surety stands, my name is written on his hands." Now, I had an uncle that was less than medium height, and we called him Shorty. And when they sang this song, I could never understand why my Uncle Shorty was standing before a throne with Johnny Martin written on his hands. It perplexed me for many years. Obviously, I did not get much out of the song at that point. Now, God expects us to do better than that. Paul says we are to sing with the Spirit, and we are to sing with the understanding also. And to sing the new song, we need to understand specifically what this new song is. The Bible keeps talking about this new song. What kind of song? What is the subject of this song? Why is it called a new song? And that's what we want to investigate this morning. Surprisingly, the new song begins in the Old Testament. You would think that the new song would begin in the New Testament, but it begins in the Old Testament, and its theme is heightened in the New Testament. What is the theme of the new song? We are clearly told this in Psalm 96. Would you turn to Psalm 96? And here he clearly tells us the theme of this new song. By the way, we have 3 commands here to sing in 2 verses. It tells what we're to sing, it tells who's to sing, and it tells what the theme of this song is, all in these 2 verses. It says, "Oh, sing unto the Lord a new song. Sing unto the Lord all the earth. Sing unto the Lord, bless his name," and here's the subject, "show forth his salvation from day to day." Now, salvation is God's power to turn a bad situation into a good situation. The word salvage is a good thing to remember when you think of salvation. Many people, when they think of salvation, they think very specifically of being saved so they can go to heaven when they die. To me, the word salvation is a very broad term that includes all of God's work to salvage this mess called man, and to salvage me and make me into what God intended for me to be. And it's a process that goes on through life. Paul was in prison, chained to Roman guards in 4-hour shifts. His enemies were out there turning his people against him. This was their chance to get his people to follow them. It was a very bad situation. But he makes an interesting comment in chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, that perplexed me for a long time till I analyzed this whole concept of salvation. He says this in verses 19 and 20, "I know that this shall turn to my salvation." Now, if you're thinking salvation in those specific terms that I just mentioned, that's a very perplexing statement. He says, "I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, that in nothing I shall be ashamed." There's sort of the key as to what he's talking about. He says, this looks like a very sad situation. It looks like there's all kinds of shame being heaped on me. People are saying things about me they shouldn't be saying. I'm here in prison. It's just not a good situation at all, but it's all going to turn. And I will not be ashamed. This will be a noble situation. This will be a situation for people to praise God about. This will be a good situation. This will have a good reputation when it's all done. I think that's one of the clearest statements in the epistles of this concept of salvation. It's the idea of God being able to take something like a man in prison and turning it into a great expression of God's ability to turn a bad situation into a good situation. Now, salvation is unique to Jehovah. The heathen have no power to save. They have to be helped themselves. There's a very amusing passage in Jeremiah chapter 10 that shows these idols who these people were depending upon, but when they had to flee, they put these idols on their donkeys and they walked alongside holding them so they wouldn't fall off. And these were the gods they worshiped. But God is able to save, because this passage, if you go on down in verse 5, it says, He made the heavens. Now, I don't know about you, but when I lose my perspective, one of the things I like to do on a clear night is to go out and look at the stars. It helps me to get my perspective. They say the universe has no end. When people say, oh, what about your God? You say he has no beginning. That makes no sense. I say, well, they say space has no end. That makes no sense either. If you can believe that, I can believe this. Space has no end. We live in the Milky Way. It's a huge disk. Do you know what the diameter of that disk is? 100,000 light years. Light traveling at the speed of 186,000 miles per second. It would take 100,000 years for it to cross the Milky Way. That means that if the Earth is 6,000 years old, that the sun, the light would have traveled 0.6% in 6,000 years across the Milky Way. Or you can look at Orion. The bottom right-hand star in Orion is Rigel. Rigel is 500 light years away. When I walk out and look at Rigel, I say, you know what? The light that's hitting my eye today started out when Columbus discovered America, and it's just now arriving. In fact, Rigel might not even be there. It might have burned out 200 years ago. Yes, and it'll be another 300 years before we know that it's not there. God made the heavens. And I look at that and I say, the Lord is my shepherd. The person who has all of this vast creation and flung it out into space and maintains it all down to the tiniest microscopic part of it. That's my shepherd. And that's the contention here. We need to help the world to understand the tremendous salvation of God. Salvation shows the heathen, it says in verse 3, it shows his glory. It shows the magnificent excellence of God. That's how I understand the word glory. It means a manifestation of excellence. The glory of the sunset that's so perfect you can't add anything to it. Or the glory of youth, a youth that is so masculine and everything a man should be, you couldn't add anything to it. Glory is the manifestation of excellence. And that's what this theme of this song is. That God is excellent, has excellent ability to turn bad situations into good situations. Now, how did David sing the new song about salvation? Let's look how he did it. Let's turn to Psalm chapter 3. Psalm 3. Now, you'll notice at the heading of this psalm, it says it was written when he fled from Absalom, his son. Let's read verses 1 and 2. This psalm, by the way, follows a very recurrent pattern of the Psalms, where David starts out with a problem, and he ends up with praise. And in between, there's a meditative prayer that changes this problem to praise in his experience. And this is what you have here. Let's look at the problem. Verses 1 and 2. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there are which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Well, here's the situation. Absalom had, through great treachery, had overthrown David, and David was fleeing from the city. And the Bible says his conspiracy was strong. We know at the end that 20,000 of the men died. So how many more there were in that army, I don't know, but that's an awful lot of people. 2 Samuel 16:15 says, all Israel went to meet Absalom. Now that's, I'm sure, an inclusive term. It doesn't include everybody, but it's a lot of people involved here. Not only that, but David had very short supplies. His friends had to bring him even the food that he ate. He was extremely dependent. He was in a very vulnerable situation. And not only that, he wasn't even sure what God thought about the situation. Zadok brought the ark to David's hiding place, and David said, take the ark back to Jerusalem. If God is pleased with me, he will deliver me. If he's not pleased with me, then let him do with me as he pleases. So he didn't even know what God thought at this point. In fact, the people had concluded, according to verse 2, that God wasn't with him. I mean, obviously, Absalom was succeeding, big time. And so the people said, well, we can easily see which side God's on. He's certainly not on that guy's side. And David was hearing all of this, and he was having his own questions about it himself. I mean, this was I'm trying to help you picture what it would be like to be in his situation. He didn't know how it was going to come out. Everything was seemingly against him. And then we have Selah. And that simply means pause here and consider this, and that's what we're doing. Let's go on to verse 3. So David now prays his prayer. We're seeing how David celebrates God's salvation. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of my head. That had happened to David many times before. This wasn't the first time this had happened. Saul hunted him down like an animal till he finally had to leave the country and live in the land of the Philistines and had to hide in caves. And God brought him out of that. Before that even, he was a little shepherd boy out on the hills, and when they called his family to choose a king, they didn't even bother with him. He was taken for granted. And the Lord lifted him out of that and made him a great man. Time after time, David had been in this situation. And he says, you have in the past, he's reflecting on the past, you have been the lifter up of my head, and many times you have turned these situations into glory. You know, the word Ebenezer means hitherto hath the Lord helped us. And I think we need to treasure those experiences like David did, because we're going to need those in these problem situations. You know, Hudson Taylor had a logo for the China Inland Mission. On the left side was the Chinese character for Ebenezer. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. On the right side was the Chinese character for Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. And we sing a song that says, here I raise my Ebenezer. And I wonder how many people know what that means. It says it right in the next phrase. Here I raised my Ebenezer, hither by thine help I've come, and I know by thy good pleasure I will safely arrive at home. You see how a memory of God's work in our lives to turn bad situations into good situations works for us when we're in the middle of the next one? And that's what's happening here with David. Oh, I didn't finish reading it. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of my head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. That Ebenezer that he remembered convinced him that this was just another time when the Lord was going to do it again. And so he goes to bed and sleeps. Look at this. Now, mind you, he's still in the situation because it says over in verse 7, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. So it hasn't happened yet. But he's convinced, basing on his experience with God's salvation so many times in the past, taking a hopeless situation and turning it into glory, he lies down absolutely convinced that that's what's going to happen again. And so he says, I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people. So he knows God has heard his prayer, and he knows that God is going to do this again because in verse 7 he says, the people who are against me are ungodly. Now David knew that he was not a perfect person, and it had not always been David's ability to trust God this way, imperfect as he was. So I want to turn, just in the middle of this, I want to turn to Psalm 139 and help you to see how David resolved his own sinfulness in relation to God's favoring him. I won't take long with this because this deserves a long treatment. It is actually my favorite psalm in the Psalms. David starts out here, this whole issue of how does God deal with sinful people? How can we trust him to turn the bad situation into glory when David, the reason, by the way, that Absalom was doing what he was doing was because Amnon had raped his sister, and David had done nothing about it. And that was wrong on David's part. David was the king. He was supposed to execute justice. He had done nothing about it. Well, I can understand why he didn't, because he had sinned with Bathsheba, and he had killed her husband. And so now how can he kill his son when God had forgiven him for such great sin? So this was a great problem. David was in the trouble he was in because of his own sin. But he had learned somewhere along the line to resolve God's ability to deal with sinful people and the sins that they have committed if they've truly repented. He starts out in the beginning of this, so just do this quickly. He complains that God knows all the things in his life, especially the bad things. And so he says, "Oh God, oh Lord, thou hast searched me and known me." That word searched is ransacked. You know, when you ransack something, you don't leave any drawers unopened and unturned. You go through everything. And he says, "You have ransacked me. You know everything about me. How can I live with this scrutiny?" He's complaining. And then he says, "Well, can I get away?" No. And you know that section. It doesn't matter what I do, God's going to be there. And then we have the insight. I'm going to read this, verses 13 through 18. "For thou hast possessed my reins." He goes back now to his birth, or before his birth. "Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well." See what God made out of that embryo? Now here's the part. "My substance was not hid from thee." See, God was ransacking him even then. God knew everything about him even then. "When I was made in secret," it wasn't secret to God, "and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect." There it is. So what does God see when he sees imperfection? Well, David says, you know what he did? He just kept working the plan until it was perfect. That was the tremendous insight, and then he breaks forth in praise here. This is a fabulous psalm for those who struggle with God's forgiveness and how he works with people who are imperfect. David says, I've learned that when God sees an imperfection, he doesn't just hammer down on it. He goes to work just to keep working the plan, the salvaging process, to make it perfect. So God's thoughts toward us are redemptive. And he says that. How precious, verse 17. "How precious also are thy thoughts unto me. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they are more than the number than the sand. When I awake, I'm still with thee." He says, God, you're precious. Your thoughts toward me are all precious. They're not judgmental. They're not punitive. They're all precious. In fact, so many of them that how much sand is there toward me personally? So that's why David can pray with confidence here in Psalm 3 that God has heard his prayer even though he's a sinful man. All right? So he lay down and slept, and he was absolutely confident that numbers mean nothing. It doesn't matter how many people Absalom has, God is going to turn this situation into glory. And so then we end with verse 8. Well, we didn't finish reading through verse 7. "I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies." That's the history. "Upon the cheekbone, and hast broken the teeth of the ungodly." And I know this is ungodly, and so I know what's going to happen. "Salvation belongs unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. Selah." Salvation is always God's work. His people are his special treasure. And so salvation is the inexhaustible theme of David's new song. If you go through his Psalms, you see he celebrates God's mercy, he celebrates God's forgiveness, he celebrates God's protection, he celebrates God's instruction, he celebrates God's correction, he celebrates God's chastisement, he celebrates God's faithfulness. In fact, it takes him 150 Psalms to get it all said. And they're all new songs. Okay? There are many facets to God's salvaging grace in our lives. His mercies are ever new. The emphasis always falls on how great God is in his provisions of salvation. Now, some people that hear a criticism against singing about what God does for me, they've said, well, David does that. So why are you criticizing these songs that talk about what God does for us? But if you read the Psalms, you find, yes, he does talk about his experience, but the final emphasis is on what God is doing, not what he's doing for me, and who God is, and how great he is. Now, I'd like for you to turn to Psalm 269 in this hymnal. Now, that was David. I gave you an example of his song, his new song, based on his experience with Absalom. I want to give you an example of a new song from real life in our present age, or at least since David. This song, "O Love That Will Not Let Me Go," was written by George Matheson. And this song reflects the amazing experience of a severely handicapped Christian at a very difficult time in his life. George Matheson was blind. He had only partial vision as a boy, and he aspired to be a great preacher. So he went to the University of Glasgow to study, and his use of his feeble eyes basically took away his sight completely. He did go on to be one of Scotland's greatest preachers. But at this point in his life, he was in a real crisis. Blind at 18, and a girlfriend to whom he was engaged that said, "I will not be married to a blind man." And she broke the engagement. This was a heartbreak he never completely recovered from. He never married. This song was written on the eve of his sister's wedding. After the wedding, the family had gone somewhere to have a family time together, but the wedding and all that was connected with it and what had happened to him, this all was weighing on him. And he was not in a good frame of mind, and so he stayed behind at the family mansion while the rest of the family went off to do something else. And there he wrestled with this issue, this problem in his life. And this poem was the miracle that happened. Let me read what he says about the composition of this poem. "It was the quickest bit of work I ever did in my life. I had the impression rather of having it dictated to me by some inward voice than of working it out myself. I'm quite sure that the whole work was completed in 5 minutes. And I'm equally sure that it never received at my hands any retouching or correction. Now, I have no natural gift of rhythm. All the other verses I have written are manufactured articles. This, though, came like a dayspring from on high. I have never been able to gain once more the same fervor in verse." But let's look at the song. Let's look what he says about his experience. "Oh, love," that was the problem right there, that second word. "Oh, love that will not let me go." Oh, so there's another love involved here. "I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean depths its flow may richer, fuller be." So here's the picture. His life is a little restless stream coming down the mountain, muddy and foaming, and it runs into the ocean where it becomes calm and part of a vast reality. And he says, here I am with this problem. I'm just going to let it go into the ocean of God's love. And there it will become calm, and there it will become large and find its true perspective. Number 2, "O light that followest all my way, I yield my flickering torch to thee." A torch that perhaps was lighted with a magnifying glass from the sun itself. He says, I give that torch back to the sun so that its little light can be absorbed in the large perspective of the sun. My heart restores its borrowed ray, that in thy sunshine's blaze its day may brighter, fairer be. O joy that seekest me through pain. That's an interesting statement. So God's joy is seeking us through pain. I cannot close my heart to thee. I trace the rainbow through the rain and feel the promise is not vain, that morn shall tearless be. And now he forgets the love, forgets the light, and forgets the joy, and embraces the cross. O cross that liftest up my head, there's the salvation. We talk about salvation through the cross. And we're usually thinking about Christ paying the price for our sin. This is the cross that lifts up his head. When he embraces the cross, O cross that liftest up my head, I dare not ask to fly from thee. I lay in dust life's glory dead, and from the ground there blossoms red life that shall tearless be. So, when he just gives the cross everything, up grows a beautiful red flower, a symbol of passionate love, of self-sacrifice, endowed with the splendor of immortality. This is the meaning and significance of the new song. This is true worship, to acknowledge God's goodness, his wisdom, and his salvaging purpose in everything that happens to us in life. To value him and his work and our trust in his salvation that's going to turn a bad situation into glory, regardless of life circumstances. That was the secret of Paul's life. That was the secret of David's life. But you have to raise your Ebenezer. You have to look back over life like David did. And you have to say, in this circumstance, many times, God has been my glory in those kinds of situations. And that's the new song. And many people have written songs out of those kinds of experiences. And if you can't write a song, at least sing one in those situations and display to everyone the glory of God. Let's sing this song, and then I'd like to sing another song also in closing. Oh, love that will not let me go. And I forgot my pitch pipe, I think. Would somebody give me a pitch? A flat. So. Oh, love that will not let me go.
Oh,
Watts says it very well, pretty much everything I said this morning. Oh, bless the Lord, my soul. Let all within me join and aid my tongue to bless his name, whose favors are divine. Now here's the verse. Oh, bless the Lord, my soul, nor let his mercies lie forgotten in unthankfulness, and without praises die. A familiar, a recurring theme in the Psalms, which I think every one of them is an example of the new song, is his mercy endureth forever. And that's what the writer here is celebrating as well. Could I have another pitch, G flat? Oh, G. Your soul, oh bless the Lord, my soul. Let all within me join, and aid my tongue to bless his name, whose favors are divine. Oh, bless the Lord, my soul, nor let his mercies lie forgotten in unthankfulness, and without praises die. Ladies, 'tis he forgives thy sins, 'tis he relieves thy pain, 'tis he that heals thy sicknesses and makes thee young again. Brethren, he crowns thy life with love when ransomed from the grave. He hath redeemed my soul from hell and sovereign power to save. 8 parts. He fills the poor with good. He gives the sufferers rest. The Lord hath judgments for the proud and justice for the oppressed. Amen. Let's sing the new song with understanding. And in the situations of life, let's expect God to turn them to our salvation. And then let's praise him for it. God bless you.